Towards the end of every year, I put together a list of my top 10 favorite books that I've read. And so, this is that list for the year 2022. So, first up is Be Thou My Vision by Jonathan Gibson. So this book, you could kind of call it a devotional, but it's a liturgy of daily worship, and consequently the phrase daily worship is now what I'll use to describe my quiet time or devotional time, right? And it is by far the best book that I've read this year. So it's a 31-day order of service, is what we would typically call them in more Baptist circles. But it gives you a liturgy to follow, an order of service to follow for your personal worship, going through a call to worship and confession of sin, a reading of God's law, an assurance of pardon, creeds, to reading through the creeds, and going through catechism questions, and then gives you a place to read scripture and a place to also have your own time of prayer. And so every time that I've passed through this book this year, I have been replacing the creed section with different sections of confessions to kind of keep the reading fresh for me. This time that I'm going through it, I'm actually back to reading the creeds that it gives there. So it takes you through the Apostles' Creed, the Nicene Creed, then the Athanasian Creed, and then it goes in reverse again. And so, and this time, for the catechism section, I'm reading through Lewis Allen's The Preacher's Catechism, which is a fantastic read. And so that's number one. Number two this year was The Pilgrim's Progress by John Bunyan, which I did a walk through chapter by chapter, week by week, as a part of the series Reading Together, in which I've done several books in that series so far. And so every time that I've done a book for Reading Together, I come away having 100-fold increase to my appreciation for the book. I think that I appreciate the book going in and then going slowly through it and getting to teach it to other people just deepens my appreciation 100-fold. And so that's the same with The Pilgrim's Progress. So immediately after finishing studying The Pilgrim's Progress and recording my final thoughts, I went home and told my wife that I just skimmed the surface of it, right? that there's so much more to The Pilgrim's Progress that it'll definitely be a yearly reread for me, I'm sure of that. And so number 3 this year was Disciplines of a Godly Man by R. Kent Hughes. And so one of the most rare categories of books that I find myself reading is occasionally you read a book that when you finish it, you wish that you had read it sooner. So John Owen's Mortification of Sin is one of the books that's in that category, and now I can add Disciplines of a Godly Man to that list. So I read it, going through all of the disciplines that he gives, taking you through disciplines of the mind and disciplines of church and ministry and disciplines of purity, and I came away thinking, I wish I'd read it sooner, right? And so I think that's a great compliment to be able to give to a book. And the men of our church also read this book together, and so I think that certainly deepened my appreciation for the book as well. This will definitely be a book that I revisit frequently. Number 4 was The Household and the War for the Cosmos. And I remember seeing the cover of this book while I was studying through the book of Ephesians and thinking from the title that it probably was going to say something similar to what I had been thinking through and what I'd been seeing, especially as I was moving through the household commands in the end of Ephesians chapter 5 and the beginning of Ephesians chapter 6. And of course, one of the sermons I titled the cosmic order of the household, because of what Paul says there in Ephesians chapter 5, verse 32, where he says, "This mystery is profound, but I'm saying that it refers to Christ and the church." So giving this wonderful picture that marriage, that how we construct our households is meant to be in miniature a picture of how God has ordered and structured the cosmos itself, the universe all around us. And so that is definitely similar to what Wiley is presenting here in this book, right? So he's presenting this idea that the way that how God works in the small things is how God ultimately shapes the big things, right? So just as our lives are shaped by each day that we live, so society is shaped by each household within it. And thus, if you want to change your life, you have to start by changing how you live today, right? You have to change each and every day. And if you want to change society as at large, then you have to start by changing how your own household is, and how your own household is going to reflect what you want society to be like in miniature. And so it is a great book that I couldn't recommend highly enough. Number 5 was The Lord's Work in the Lord's Way and No Little People by Francis Schaeffer. So this was 2 sermons of Francis Schaeffer put together in this little book, and it's a part of Crossway's new series called The Short Classics. And so I've read 2 of those books so far, the other one being by Thomas Chalmers, and that's a great one as well. And so these 2 sermons have a very similar theme to the previous book by Wiley, which is that God works through the little things, right? That God working through the small things in order to change everything, right? So great reads. Number 6 was The Monster in the Hollows by Andrew Peterson. So this is the 3rd book of Peterson's fantasy series called The Wingfeather Saga, and I am a massive fantasy fan. So I read through The Lord of the Rings every year, and so it should just be understood that Lord of the Rings is one of my favorite books, and so I don't put them on this list in a year. But to be honest, I had to press through the first 2 books of the series. They were okay. The 4th book, I listened to it as an audiobook, and I think I listened to almost all of it in a single day. It was great, but the best in the series, in my humble opinion, is this 3rd book, The Monster in the Hollows. So the ending, and even I can point to one particular sentence towards the ending of the book, just had me in tears, and that has, I can't remember a fiction book that has moved me as much as this one has, and so it was just a great book. I loved it. Number 7, The Gospel According to Mark by G. Campbell Morgan. So, having never read of Morgan before, I first opened this book last year as I began to preach through the first half of Mark's Gospel, and this quickly became my favorite resource among many excellent resources that I consulted while studying Mark. Morgan had an excellent way of drawing out the overall connective themes of several passages, and my sermons were very often shaped for the better after reading his remarks. So in particular, his sermons over the Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. He actually doesn't touch a whole lot on Jesus in Gethsemane, and his reasoning for that is wonderful. And then his sermon on the widow who gave the two coins. Those are 2 sermons of his that in this book that particularly stood out to me. So, number 8, The Biggest Story Bible Storybook by Kevin DeYoung. My 5-year-old daughter and I read this storybook Bible together, and while this book is certainly an expansion of The Biggest Story, it is also quite different, right? So my daughter and I read the original together a few times, but it never became one of her favorites. But she enjoyed this Bible storybook way more. She almost always asked to read 1 chapter before bed, and she is excited for us to go through it again next year. Number 9 was The Christian on the Mount by Thomas Watson. So what would a yearly list of my favorite books be without at least one book by Thomas Watson making the list? And so this was Watson's discussion of how Christians ought to meditate upon Scripture, and everything that makes Watson one of the easiest and most profitable Puritans to read is present in this book. And so what more can we say? Read and practice what you read here. Number 10, this one's fun. Eggs Are Expensive, Sperm is Cheap by Greg Crable, however you say his last name. The subtitle of this book is 50 Politically Incorrect Thoughts for Men, and that's a correct subtitle. So these are politically incorrect thoughts that generally make all the sense in the world. So if you look up any reviews of this book, you will find that some people are surprised that the book is not written from an explicitly Christian worldview or framework. And so if you have that expectation, then the kind of the crassness of this book will be a little bit jarring to you. And so it's not a Christian book, but the book is, however, full of much common grace truths, much common revelation that God has given to us, to all of humanity, that should be spoken clearly. And that's exactly what the author does in this book, is that he says them many times without much qualifications, and which is exactly as they should be spoken. So those are the 10. One last honorable mention is The Story of the World, Volume 1 by Susan Wise Bauer. So this is another book that my daughter and I read together. And while it is not a perfect book, and while I certainly would have made some different decisions had I been writing the History of the World book, well, writing the history of the world, especially for children, is an undertaking that cannot please everyone. And so based on many reviews that I've read, many were disappointed to find so many Christian themes within a history book for children, while there's plenty of others that were disappointed at not finding more Christian themes within a history book for children. And all that's to say, it's not a perfect book, and I don't think it could be a perfect book, given the scope of everything that Susan Wise Bauer is trying to cover in this book. But it is worth reading. It's an excellent book, and it was certainly worth discussing with my daughter. We had a great time in discussing all of the chapters of this volume covering the ancient world. And so after taking a break to do our Advent readings this year, she is thoroughly excited to dive into Volume 2, the Middle Ages. And so those are my favorite books for 2022. I hope that you will grab some of them. They're all excellent reads. And so until next time, thank you for listening. Grace and peace.